In 2010, in the heart of a prosperous Europe, Greece, the cradle of Western democracy, suddenly became the epicenter of the most devastating financial storm since World War II. From its sunlit coastlines and ancient ruins, this small nation transformed overnight into a symbol of debt, chaos, and despair. Within months, Greece went from being a proud member of the European Union to the eye of a storm that threatened to drown the entire global financial system. In Athens, the streets burned with protests, banks shut their doors, and ordinary citizens like Maria, a 40-year-old schoolteacher, stood in long, anxious lines, desperate to withdraw the last few euros from a lifetime of savings. Meanwhile, in Brussels and Berlin, European leaders held emergency meetings, gripped by fear that the euro, the symbol of continental unity, could collapse from a single misstep. The strange thing was, Greece wasn't the only country in debt. So why could a small economy, accounting for less than 2% of the Eurozone's GDP, shake all of Europe to its core? The answer lay hidden in fabricated financial statements, betrayed trust, and a painful truth about a currency that was never as perfect as it seemed. When Greece joined the Eurozone in 2001, its citizens believed they had secured a golden ticket to prosperity. Cheap credit flooded in, banks lent freely, wages rose, and the government spent lavishly. Athens shone brightly as it prepared to host the 2004 Olympic Games, a celebration of national revival. Yet behind that glittering facade, massive public debts were buried under creative accounting, and unchecked spending quietly built a ticking time bomb. By 2009, the illusion shattered. The Greek government revealed that its budget deficit wasn't 6% of GDP, as previously reported. It was over 15%. Investors panicked, Greek bonds were dumped, and borrowing costs skyrocketed. A nation once hailed as a European success story now stood on the brink of bankruptcy, something once thought possible only in developing countries. The Greek debt crisis was not just a story of reckless spending. It was a warning about the cracks in Europe's grand design, a union bound by one currency but divided by fiscal realities. When Greece trembled, all of Europe shuddered. From Paris to Rome, from Madrid to Frankfurt, one haunting question echoed: if Greece falls, who's next? This story isn't just about numbers and markets. It's about broken dreams, the fragility of trust, and how one small nation forced the world to confront the limits of European unity. To understand why Greece, a country representing less than 2% of the Eurozone economy, could bring an entire continent to its knees, we must first step back and look at the bigger picture, a Europe already struggling beneath the weight of its own contradictions. After the global financial crisis of 2008, the deadly flaws within the structure of the euro began to surface. When the U.S. housing bubble burst in 2008, triggering a worldwide financial meltdown, Europe's banks, heavily invested in American assets, suddenly found themselves starved of liquidity. The European financial system, once believed to be untouchable, turned out to be deeply dependent on the cheap flow of credit from Wall Street. Major economies like Germany, France, and the United Kingdom were forced to inject hundreds of billions of euros to bail out their banks and prevent a cascading collapse. As the first wave of the storm began to calm, a new threat emerged, not from New York, but from within Europe itself. Greece, along with Portugal, Ireland, Italy, and Spain, a group mockingly labeled pigs by global investors, an acronym that also carried a sneer at their supposed fiscal weakness, became the center of the world's attention. These nations shared a common currency, but their economies, productivity levels, and fiscal discipline could not have been more different. The Eurozone, born in 1999, had been hailed as a grand vision, one currency to unite Europe and help it compete with the United States. But behind the glittering promise lay a fatal design flaw. The member states shared a monetary policy but kept their own national budgets. It was like a fleet of ships sharing the same engine but steering in different directions. For countries like Germany and the Netherlands, the euro served as an export advantage, keeping their currency from rising too high. But for Greece, it became a golden ticket to disaster. Low interest rates and an endless stream of cheap capital from German and French banks flooded into Greece like a tidal wave. The government in Athens, intoxicated by easy money, raised public sector wages, expanded social benefits, and poured billions into grandiose public projects, from Olympic stadiums to extravagant infrastructure. In Athens, people like Nikos, a mid-level bank employee, enjoyed steady pay raises and effortless access to home loans, convinced that the new age of prosperity would last forever. But behind that dazzling facade, a debt bomb was quietly ticking. Greece had been concealing its true deficit with complex financial engineering, aided by Wall Street giants like Goldman Sachs, who helped transform massive debts into numbers that looked deceptively clean on paper. Meanwhile, in Brussels and Frankfurt, the power centers of the European Union and the European Central Bank, no one wanted to puncture the illusion of a flawless Eurozone. This complacency blinded them to the cracks already spreading across the walls of Europe's monetary fortress. By 2009, as global investors began scrutinizing balance sheets in the aftermath of the 2008 crash, the truth finally broke through. Greece's debt had exceeded $300 billion, roughly 180% of its GDP. Greek bonds were dumped in panic, borrowing costs soared, and the nation's financial engine began to groan under unbearable pressure. The most terrifying part? Greece couldn't print its own money to save itself. The euro was controlled by the European Central Bank, a distant institution tasked with protecting the interests of the entire bloc, not one desperate nation. As ordinary Greeks like Nikos faced the terrifying prospect of losing their jobs and watching their bank accounts vanish, German and French banks, once generous lenders, began to fear massive losses of their own. The Greek crisis was no longer just a national issue. It had exposed a brutal truth. Europe was united by a currency, but divided by destiny. From the offices of Berlin to the conference halls of Paris, one haunting question echoed through every corridor of power. If Greece collapses, can the euro survive? A small crack in Athens now threatened to shake an entire continent. By late 2009, when the newly elected Prime Minister George Papandreou addressed the nation, no one could have imagined that a few sentences would ignite the largest financial storm in Europe's modern history. He revealed the truth that previous governments had long concealed. Greece's budget deficit wasn't 6% of GDP, it was over 15%. In that moment, the curtain of deception was ripped apart. Investors who once believed that Greece's finances were safely shielded by the Eurozone panicked and fled. Government bonds were dumped worldwide, and Greece's borrowing costs skyrocketed from 4% to 12%, then to 18%, levels no nation could possibly sustain. Within months, Athens stood at the edge of bankruptcy. But this tragedy hadn't appeared overnight. It was the product of decades of mismanagement, political ambition, and financial illusion. After joining the Eurozone in 2001, Greece enjoyed a flood of cheap money unlike anything in its history. The government spent as if its treasury were bottomless, on highways, hospitals, seaports, and especially the Athens 2004 Olympic Games, which cost over $11 billion, far beyond the country's means. Public sector wages soared, social programs expanded, yet tax revenues lagged as tax evasion became a national sport. In Athens, people like Eleni, a postal worker, rejoiced as her salary rose and banks offered effortless loans to buy homes, unaware that the country beneath her feet was sinking deeper into debt. Each year, Greece borrowed new money to repay old debt, creating a snowball effect that grew larger and heavier with every passing year. Instead of reforming, Athens chose to hide. With the help of Western investment banks, most notably Goldman Sachs, Greece used complex currency swap agreements to disguise the true size of its deficit. Gigantic debts were transformed into seemingly harmless financial instruments, invisible in official reports. On paper, Greece still met the European Union's strict fiscal standards. In reality, its mountain of debt had climbed past $300 billion, nearly 180% of GDP, waiting for a single spark to explode. The 2008 global financial crisis became that spark. As investors across the world began re-examining balance sheets, Eurostat, the EU's statistical agency, finally uncovered the truth in late 2009. Credit rating agencies like Fitch, Moody's, and Standard & Poor's simultaneously downgraded Greek bonds to junk status, slamming the door on any access to international borrowing. Inside Greece, public trust shattered. From Athens to Thessaloniki, thousands of citizens crowded in front of ATMs, terrified that the euros in their hands would soon be worth nothing. As the value of the euro in Greece plummeted, the image of Eleni, standing in line from dawn to withdraw the savings of a lifetime, became the defining symbol of financial panic, a scene unseen in modern Europe. By early 2010, Greece had run out of options. The treasury was empty, credit markets were closed, yet billions in debt payments were coming due. On April 23, 2010, speaking solemnly from the small island of Castellariso, Prime Minister George Papandreou addressed the nation. "We have no other choice. I have asked for the support of the European Union and the International Monetary Fund to save our country from disaster." The words were simple, but devastating. They marked Greece's surrender, the birthplace of democracy now forced to beg for rescue from the very union it had once joined with pride. Yet that same moment became a brutal awakening for all of Europe. The Greek crisis was no longer about one country's overspending. It exposed the deep fractures at the core of the Eurozone, a system united by currency but divided by responsibility. As Athens trembled, the shockwaves spread outward to Madrid, Lisbon, Rome, and even Frankfurt, confronting the continent with a haunting question: if Greece collapses, what will happen to the European dream? When Greece officially requested assistance from the European Union in April 2010, the tremor was felt far beyond Athens. The ground beneath Europe's feet seemed to give way. A small nation, contributing less than 2% to the Eurozone's GDP, had managed to shake one of the world's most powerful monetary unions. Across global trading floors, the phrase sovereign debt crisis became a chilling mantra, accompanied by one terrifying question: if Greece defaults, who will be the next domino to fall? From Madrid to Lisbon, from Dublin to Rome, government bond yields soared. Southern European nations, already struggling with fragile finances, found themselves under merciless scrutiny from investors. The cracks in the financial system spread like wildfire. In Brussels and Berlin, emergency meetings became routine. Germany, Europe's economic anchor, realized that a Greek collapse would devastate German and French banks, the largest holders of Greek debt. But at home, the mood in Germany was furious. Ordinary citizens saw Greece as a burden. Lazy freeloaders living off Europe, a slogan amplified by tabloids, deepening resentment between Northern and Southern Europe. Amid this toxic atmosphere, the first bailout package was announced in May 2010, worth $110 billion, jointly funded by the European Union and the International Monetary Fund, IMF. In return, Greece was forced to implement drastic austerity measures, slashing public spending, raising taxes, privatizing state assets, and reforming pensions. On paper, it was a plan to restore fiscal discipline. In reality, it was a bitter medicine for a dying patient. The Greek economy, already shrinking, plunged into a deep recession. Consumer spending collapsed. Unemployment soared to 25% overall, and among the youth, an unthinkable 50%. In Athens, Maria, a 30-year-old shop assistant, lost her job when her employer shut down, surviving only through help from her parents. Each time the government announced new pay cuts or tax hikes, the streets erupted, smoke, stones, and crowds raging outside Parliament. Graffiti scrawled across city walls read, "We are not numbers, we are people." It was the desperate cry of a nation trapped between austerity and a broken dream. But austerity couldn't save Greece. Budget deficits fell, yes, but GDP collapsed even faster, pushing the debt-to-GDP ratio higher than before. A vicious cycle emerged. The more the government cut, the smaller the economy became. The smaller the economy, the less tax revenue came in, and the less revenue, the deeper the debt. Economists would later call it the fiscal death spiral, a poison disguised as a cure. Meanwhile, confidence in the euro itself began to crumble. In Frankfurt, the European Central Bank, ECB, faced a nightmare scenario: Grexit, the possibility of Greece leaving the Eurozone, bringing down the dream of a unified currency. In a desperate attempt to prevent collapse, the ECB injected emergency liquidity and began buying Greek bonds to keep the nation's banks afloat. But that was only a temporary fix, not a solution. In 2012, the second bailout package, worth $130 billion, was launched, accompanied by an unprecedented move. Private creditors, including major banks and hedge funds, were forced to write off nearly $100 billion in Greek debt, the largest debt haircut in modern financial history. Yet the price was devastating. Greece's economic sovereignty was effectively erased. The so-called Troika, the European Commission, the ECB, and the IMF, now controlled every aspect of Greek fiscal policy, from government budgets to public investments. To ordinary Greeks, their country no longer seemed governed from Athens, but from Berlin and Brussels. As the crisis dragged on, public trust shattered further. In 2015, the left-wing Syriza party rose to power, promising to end austerity once and for all. Prime Minister Alexis Tsipras and his outspoken finance minister, Yanis Varoufakis, became global symbols of defiance, challenging the might of Europe's financial establishment. But reality struck fast. As Greek banks ran out of cash, citizens were restricted to withdrawing only $60 a day. Syriza, cornered and exhausted, was forced to sign a third bailout agreement, with even harsher terms. Maria, once a young shop worker in Athens, now packed her bags for Germany in search of work. One among hundreds of thousands of Greeks who emigrated, carrying with them the heartbreak of a nation brought to its knees. The Greek debt crisis lasted 5 long years, shrinking the nation's economy by nearly 30% and plunging millions into poverty and unemployment. But its impact stretched far beyond Greece's borders. It revealed a painful truth. The euro, meant to symbolize unity, had become a mirror reflecting Europe's divide between rich and poor, between discipline and despair. Greece survived, but barely, like a body scarred by its own salvation. And in Athens's agony, the world saw something terrifying. The European dream was not invincible. When the dust of crisis finally settled, Greece emerged from the darkness carrying wounds that would take generations to heal. An economy reduced by nearly a third, a fractured society, and a nation whose faith in the future had been burned away. Yet from those ruins came a sobering realization. Perhaps Greece was never the cause, but the symptom of a far greater disease, the illusion of eternal financial stability. Between 2010 and 2015, Greece became the world's harshest laboratory for globalization, a place where the ideals of a common currency and European solidarity were pushed to their breaking point. The result was a painful lesson, not just for Athens, but for the entire world. A reminder of what happens when ambition outpaces reality. Lesson 1. Debt is never a ticket to prosperity. In the early 2000s, Greece lived under the illusion that the euro was a key to limitless wealth. Cheap loans flooded the country, fueling grand projects like the 2004 Olympic Games, soaring public sector salaries, and generous social benefits. But as the story of Nikos, a taxi driver who bought a home with easy credit only to lose his job when the crisis hit, reminds us, debt always comes with a price. When the snowball of public debt grew beyond control, Greece collapsed faster than anyone imagined. This is an eternal warning. Prosperity built on borrowed money is a castle made of sand, beautiful but doomed to crumble with the first wave. Lesson 2. When you don't control your currency, you don't control your destiny. By joining the Eurozone in 2001, Greece believed it had entered Europe's wealthy family. But when the crisis struck, the euro, the once a symbol of unity, became a chain. Greece could not devalue its currency to boost competitiveness, could not print money to repay debt, and could not design its own financial policies. Every critical decision was made in Brussels and Frankfurt. People like Maria, a school teacher forced to leave her hometown and seek work in Germany, paid the price for that loss of control, with years of uncertainty and lost dreams. The Greek crisis exposed the Eurozone's cruel paradox. A shared currency without shared responsibility is nothing more than a ticking time bomb. Lesson 3. Trust is the most fragile foundation of any system. The Greek crisis wasn't just about numbers. It was about the collapse of faith, faith between citizens and their government, between nations within the Eurozone, and between investors and the markets themselves. Once trust shatters, no central bank in the world can repair it. The haunting image of citizens standing in endless ATM lines, terrified that their life savings would vanish, remains a painful reminder of that truth. Greece taught the world that any financial system, no matter how powerful, can collapse from a single crack in confidence. What's truly alarming is that the story of Greece is not just history. The signs of a new debt crisis are already emerging. Global debt has surpassed 300% of world GDP, and nations from Argentina to Sri Lanka, from Turkey to major economies like the United States and China, are once again drowning in borrowing. What happened in Athens was not an isolated tragedy. It was a warning that the world still hasn't learned its lesson. And yet Greece endures. Its slow recovery stands as a testament to the resilience of the human spirit in the face of collapse. But the scars remain. Families who lost their homes, young people who left their homeland, dreams that never returned. Greece is not just a country that defaulted within the Eurozone. It is a mirror reflecting the limits of financial ambition. A world where capital moves faster than morality and profit often obscures the truth. In the end, the Greek story is a haunting reminder. Every financial empire, no matter how mighty, can fall if built on false beliefs. And if history had a voice, perhaps it would whisper, "Be careful, because the lessons of yesterday could become the disasters of tomorrow."